So we're just going to give it 30 seconds for participants to enter the room, and then we'll kick things off. Great. I think we can start going. I know that people will start trickling in, but welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining our discussion on rising Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, civic engagement in the run-up to the 2020 election. My name is Nick Sung. I am the moderator for this event and the co-chair of AAPI Caucus, which is a student organization at the Harvard Kennedy School, which celebrates AAPI diverse histories and promotes our shared political identity. We're co-hosting this event alongside the Ash Center. And before we begin, we got a couple of quick announcements. The first, very importantly, is that the Ash Center and AAPI Caucus would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Secondly, we'll dedicate the last 20 minutes of our time together to respond to your questions in the audience. We encourage you to submit these questions at any time through the discussion by using the Q&A box at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Thirdly, we also want to take this opportunity to let the Harvard community members know about the Harvard Votes Challenge. This is a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a civic culture here at Harvard by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to join this movement at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. And finally, we'd like to note that this event is being recorded and it will be available after this event concludes on the Ash Center website, as well as on the Ash Center YouTube channel. So let's dive right in. To begin with, I'd like to start with Alexis Anderson-Reed. For the audience, to give a little bit of background, Alexis has been CEO of State Voices for 2 years, leading the efforts of state affiliate tables to register voters and build enduring organizations which amplify the voice and power of communities of color in 25 states across the country. She previously worked with the Funders Committee on Civic Participation and as the director of Wisconsin Voices. So welcome, Alexis. To begin with, I'd love to delve a little bit deeper into these state chapters or state tables. Your organization aims to improve civic access, meaning people can effectively participate in our democracy, and civic representation, meaning that people's political power is not diluted or distorted. It's October 2020, and I'd love to, based on this context, delve into your experience and your organization's grassroots work. What have you identified as the key levers for increasing voter turnout? And what are the barriers to civic engagement that worry you the most for November? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm tuning in. Thanks so much, Nick and Miles, for having us here today. To the Culture Foundation for supporting this important discussion. As Nick said, I work with State Voices, and we have 23 state coalitions, and we call these tables. We have over 600 partner organizations that are members of these tables, and then we have an additional 200 partners in non-state tables. And we really work in this model because we know that none of us can do this work alone. We have to have collective power in order to achieve, our aligned vision for building a true multiracial democracy that's grounded in building power for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, and all people of color so that we can thrive and that we can live in our full dignity. And the way that we approach our work is through what we call an integrated civic engagement model, which essentially means that we move beyond some of the narrow definitions of civic engagement that a lot of people think about. So, some people think about civic engagement just as volunteering or registering to vote or getting people out to vote. And yes, that is part of it, but it's not all of it. It also includes advocacy. It includes issue organizing, leadership development, and movement building. And so it's this intersectional approach that really centers people, it centers communities in deep, authentic partnership and relationship with one another. And I truly believe this is what is key to increasing voter turnout. People know when they are being used and when they're being targeted just for electoral purposes. I don't know how many folks have ever done, canvassing either as a volunteer or worked on a campaign. But when we canvass in BIPOC communities, if they haven't seen you before, they will let you know. And they will also let you know you're only here to get my vote, and we're not likely going to see you again for another 2 years, right? And so when they say another 2 years, they're talking about the next midterm or the next federal election. And they're completely right in saying this because that is their experience. And that's how most organizations, especially around civic engagement, have previously worked. And so, at State Voices, our model is that we believe in building trust year round. We connect the issues that are impacting folks every single day in their lives to the election. And we also situate the election in a longer term strategy to build political power. And I always lift up, a quote from Alicia Garza, who says, voting alone will not liberate us, but it's an important litmus test for our organizing and our collective voice and our quest to build political power and freedom. And so as a coalition, we also worked in an aligned strategy. So when I was the table director in Wisconsin at Wisconsin Voices, which I'm sure you can hear in my accent, we had over 30 organizations, all with different missions, right? From the League of Conservation Voters to the Center for Popular Democracy affiliates who were working on economic justice, to education groups, to small grassroots organizers who are working on criminal justice reform, come together around a collective goal to plan to turn out Black and Brown voters in Milwaukee. And we coordinated turf, we shared data and technology, we did collective training, and we shared funding and resources. And that year we saw this huge increase and an historic increase in Black voter turnout in the city. And I will also say that voter education and community education is key. There's so much information coming at folks these days, and we know 2020 even more in years past. And so people need the correct information to be able to cast their ballot with confidence. And sometimes organizations like mine aren't necessarily the best messengers. Sometimes, that's where organizing comes in. And that's when you have to connect with people and have that trust with folks and the people, the neighborhoods, the schools and churches who have trust and influence, and ask them if they can help organize and educate their people. There's 3 things I want to lift up that I'm worried about this year. Misinformation, disinformation campaigns is one of them, aimed at the entire electorate, but especially people of color, with the goal of deliberately spreading lies and fear about the voting process or trying to undermine the integrity of our entire election system. I'm also extremely worried about election day safety and security. We're already seeing white supremacists try to intimidate, voters, even during early voting. We just saw stories coming out of Virginia. And with Trump's pleas for his supporters to watch over the polls and his comment for the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, his dog whistles, or I would say overt racism, all on the heels of the largest racial uprisings we've seen in our country's history. I believe we have to be concerned about what this will mean for people of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI communities who are just trying to exercise their right to vote. So many of our organizations over the last number of weeks have been putting trainings and programs in place to train and protect communities around intimidation, around violence that they may experience or witness on election day or the days leading up to and after the election. And finally, I'll just end with each of these, so disinformation, misinformation campaigns, and election day violence. I've been doing this work for 15 years. This is really the first election where this is rising to the top as a major issue. And so this is on top of all of the voter suppression tactics that we have seen year after year and that are still plaguing us. And so, we're part of an election protection coalition with lawyers and volunteers to help voters if they're having a problem casting their ballot on election day. And we saw 3 times as many voters reach out to the election protection hotline in the primaries. And unfortunately, there just wasn't enough people to support that influx of callers. And so I have concerns that the system is going to be overwhelmed on election day, and therefore many voters won't be able to vote, even though it's fully within their right, all due to voter suppression tactics like, photo ID, like the changing of polling locations and limiting polling sites, as well as residency requirements. And so, I feel like there is some things that we are concerned about with only 28 days left to the election. And then I think that there's so much that organizations across this country have done to make sure that they're organizing their communities and making sure folks of color can vote with confidence.
Thank you very much, Alexis. That was quite the tour de force and quite the foundation to build upon with Terry and Sayu as we move forward. And I feel like this is a great foundation to set up Terry actually to delve a little bit further into the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And I would love to reach out now to Terry. For the audience, in her role as with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC, Terry Alminis has led the effort for a full count of all Americans and was part of the legal team successfully opposing the current administration's efforts to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. She's the co-chair of the Census Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and one of the National Organization of Women's Suffrage 100. So Terry, thank you very much for coming on, and thank you very much for speaking with us today. I'd love to build upon Alexis's points that she was making, and specifically delve into your organization's survey that you released last month. AAJC found that, quote, most Asian American voters, 54% of them say they prefer to vote by mail or vote by absentee ballot rather than to vote in person, of which only 26% of AAPI respondents responded to. Are you worried that the Asian American community's vote may not be counted with the US Postal Service targeted by partisan politics? And more broadly, and related to the question I asked Alexis, what are the barriers that most worry you for November, especially for the Asian American community?
Sure, great. Thanks, Nick. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Miles and all. I'm happy to join you all today. I am Terry Minnis. I'm Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs, and I apologize, I can't be on video. I'm actually on the side of the road trying to fix a flat tire, full disclosure. So I am multitasking in a way that I'm not used to multitasking right now. But to your question, Nick, I think, of course, we are concerned about what impact what's been going on with the US Postal Service will have on our election. I know we're all concerned about that. And as you noted, for Asian Americans, more than a majority have a strong preference for voting by mail or absentee. And that's not necessarily too surprising for a number of reasons. The primary of which is that Asian Americans are, have a very huge barrier that they face in trying to cast their ballots, and that is the language barrier, right? We know that over 70% of Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home. We know that roughly 1 in 2 Asian American adults are limited English proficient, and that is have some difficulties with the Asian language. And so voting by mail is one way in which limited English proficient voters have found to, have greater access to the ballot, right? That is, they are able to vote from the comfort of their home. They're able to take their time. They don't necessarily feel the pressure that they might otherwise feel at a polling location with, a line developing behind them and trying to, cast their ballot. And of course, they are able to, consult with friends and family without necessarily having to schedule time to go to the polls together, because of course every voter has the right under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act to bring an assister of their choice, so long as they are the person helping them is not their employer or their union rep. But if they need help because of a disability or because of the inability to read or write English, then they can bring someone in with them. But of course, voting by mail sort of means you don't have to coordinate schedules. You don't have to figure out how to get to the polls together at the same time. So not surprising that Asian Americans do have a preference for vote by mail. And just to delve a little bit more into the issue around the language barrier, I did want to flag that the way that this often plays out for Asian Americans is that we see that of eligible Asian Americans, even though we've seen an increase in the Asian American electorate over the last several decades, we also know there continues to be an ongoing persistent gap between voter participation, between Asian American voter participation and white voters, right? That is, it's about a 15–20% gap from election to election. And we do believe that that is primarily because of the language barrier. And then I will just, some of the ways in which that plays out, of course, is that we know that the voting process is very complex in this country. It is, of course, differs between states. It is not necessarily always the most intuitive. The language in which voting materials are written, highly complex, right? I think one study that looked at it found that across the 50 states that the language of ballot measures, voting materials, and the like ran at about a high school or collegiate level, and I think even maybe a 12th grade and collegiate level, which compared to the level of English needed to naturalize in this country, that is of course significantly lower. So you can imagine for people for whom English is a second language, the voting process is going to be particularly complex, especially if they come from a country that is, they've immigrated from a country that has a vastly different democratic system. Maybe it doesn't have a democratic system, right? So trying to navigate all of that is going to be more difficult for limited English proficient voters. We also know, of course, that even though there are laws on the books to protect language minority voters and to assure access and assistance at the polls, that they don't always have that at the polls. Sometimes it can be, poll workers who maybe are not as familiar with some of the federal laws, and so mistakenly deny people the language assistance that they are, warranted through law. But other times we've also seen limited English proficient voters being, facing just straight up hostility and discrimination at the polls because of their language abilities, because of the accent of their voice, and the like. And so that's something we are definitely mindful of, particularly during the chaotic election cycle in this global pandemic. We know that even with the expansion of vote by mail, which we think is certainly a good way to help address the public health and safety concerns, that that those systems that are put in place must also comply with existing federal laws around language assistance, as well as state and local laws. So for example, Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, if a jurisdiction is covered and they move to a vote by mail system or expand it, then they need to make sure that that system complies with Section 203. At the same time, we also know that while vote by mail can be an attractive option for language minority voters and limited English proficient Asian American voters, the reality is that some people may prefer to go in person. And so there has to be, safe options for in-person voting for Asian American voters this election. And that might be because, some of the, as I said, in a Section 203 covered jurisdiction, they might want to have access to the bilingual poll workers that can help explain some of these more complex processes and whatnot for voters. And, the poll worker would be more trained up and able to assist and may have a better grasp of some of the vernacular and vocabulary related to elections that, a friend or a relative might not have. And even if you have a friend or relative helping you under Section 208, having access even to an English-speaking poll worker, again, somebody who is more familiar with the voting processes. So, I think that is something that we're also very mindful of this election cycle, is that those opportunities also exist for voters. The last thing I will touch upon, I know Alexis touched upon this too, is certainly we are concerned about the, the rhetoric that's out there right now. We know that historically Asian American voters have faced challenges and intimidation at the polls simply because of how they look or how they sound. Right, there is the stereotype of Asian Americans being perpetual foreigners. And so the automatic suspicion simply because of how the voter looks or how they sound, that they must be trying to vote fraudulently because there's no way they could possibly be eligible to vote. So we already know that exists. We've seen that happen in the past. We've seen challenges of only Asian American voters, whether that's in Bayou La Batre, whether that was in, in Seattle, Washington, where that's happened. And we can only imagine that it's only going to be worse this time around with all of the anti-Asian sentiments, rhetoric, and violence that we've seen amidst, the COVID-19 pandemic. We expect that to spill over into the voting space as well. And so, like Alexis said, definitely mindful of that and how we can help make sure that people are aware of their rights, but also, feel safe in voting. So just finally, just flagging that we do have several resources. We at Advancing Justice AAJC have a Election 2020 webpage on our website. It's at advancingjustice-aajc.org/election 2020. And on there you can find translated fact sheets, including fact sheets, just sort of a general Election 2020 fact sheet, as well as a fact sheet on how, like best practices, if you will, about how to maintain safety in the COVID-19 era with respect to voting in person. And we have these fact sheets will be translated into up to 11 languages, and we do have partners on the ground, and we'll have state fact sheets for maybe about 10 states where we have partners on the ground working. And then I would just flag, we do also run an Asian language hotline with API Vote. It's 888-API-VOTE. And that hotline provides assistance in English, Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. And we are, ready to answer people's questions. I'd like to say there are no questions too big or small. We're happy to answer questions and help people figure out, are they registered to vote, or if they're actually having a serious problem at the, while trying to vote, we are ready and able to help them with that too. We are a part of the suite of the 866R Vote suite. Again,
Yeah, Terry, it seems like you got a lot of information here, and this is actually directly related to a question that was posed in the chat. So thank you very much for this. And I think that we're actually in the chat posting a couple more links and URLs that you sent to that they can find more information. And I think that there's a through line that you and Alexis were talking about related to voter intimidation at the polls. Alexis, you were talking about Proud Boys and Trump administration, President Trump just last week calling them to stand by and stand back, or stand back and stand by. And thank you very much, Terry, also for speaking to not only the historical voter suppression, but also the specific year in which there's been a lot of misinformation surrounding COVID-19, leading to a specific and direct rise in AAPI discrimination, hate crimes, and harassment. But I'd love to actually switch a little bit to Sayu, moving away from focus on voters to people and Asian Americans who are actually running for office. So to give a little bit of background to the audience, Sayu Bhojwani, through her work with the New American Leaders, has been an engine of efforts to encourage leaders of immigrant communities to take on leadership roles, including running for public office. Prior to her work with New American Leaders, she was the Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs for the City of New York and the founder of the South Asian Youth Alliance in Queens. Sayu, welcome. So I'd love to transition and build off of Alexis and Terry's points. There was a recent Pew Research study which was talking about and found that Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic group of eligible voters in the United States, with naturalized immigrants mainly driving this rise. First question to you would be, why is it so important for new Americans to not only vote, but serve and represent their communities in office?
Thank you, and thanks, Miles, for always thinking of me and convening these great panels. I'm gonna actually also talk just a little bit about Asian American voters as a way to connect the two questions that you asked, Nick. One of the things that I've been sharing with folks this year in particular is that part of the challenge that Asian American voters face is not just the challenges that exist within kind of our communities in terms of lack of information or language access, et cetera. It's also that there's a narrative that suggests that the voters we need to care about are white voters. And so there's a lot of effort that's placed in disaggregating the white voter population, right? So that's white working class voters, white college educated women. You hear these subgroups of white voters being talked about, and thereby I think what the message that we get around that is that these voters matter, right? And then you hear about Asian Americans and Latinos and Black voters without any disaggregation. And particularly as we're talking about AAPI voters, this idea that AAPI voters are somehow too complex to reach because of all of the issues that we talk about. And so I just want to name that as something that we also need to challenge, that yes, it's our responsibility to work within our communities to provide the information and mobilize voters, but that those who candidates and political party leaders have a responsibility as well to learn about our communities and to invest in the resources and the time that it takes to learn about how to reach these voters. Now, why Asian American candidates matter is because they are the key messengers and ambassadors for mobilizing voters. And they're not just mobilizing Asian American voters, but they're mobilizing anyone in their district, right? So that also want to be very clear that the folks that we train are not necessarily running in districts that are majority minority. So Chris Chung is an alum of ours. He serves in the Indiana state legislature. He unseated a Republican, but he serves in a district that is not predominantly Asian American. Stephanie Chang is a state senator in Michigan. She also represents a district that is predominantly African American and not predominantly Asian American. And so what we're seeing is that it's possible for Asian American candidates to represent any district in America in the same way that a white man can represent any district in America. What we're not seeing enough of is targeted resources and investment in understanding Asian American voting behaviors and reaching those Asian American voters, right? And I'll just end on this one point that, I am an Asian American voter. I did not become a citizen until 2000, so it's 20 years. For the first 5 or 6 years, I never heard from a political party or political leader, right? It wasn't until I became, on my own volition, a prime voter that I started to get way too many emails and phone calls and mailers, right? But that responsibility rested solely on me, and I happened to be a highly civically engaged, English-speaking person. Had I not done that on my own, the responsibility would rest on groups like Terry's and Alexis, which as we know, those groups are underfunded and the funding is cyclical, and there's very little understanding of the resources that it takes to organize communities year round. So the ability to mobilize Asian American candidates allows them to engage with voters around their issues, around their concerns. And then, as we know, by having an Asian American or a part Asian American woman on the ticket, it sends a signal to all of us that it's possible for any one of us to lead in this country. And that's a very important message as well.
I'd love to dig a little bit into that later, and maybe we can go into Kamala Harris being on a major party ticket. But actually, Sayu, because you're the last one in the queue, I would love to ask a follow-up question related to your organization's recent research publication and kind of delve into the intersectionality between race and gender. Your organization has identified a clear gender gap in new American representation in state legislatures. In comparison to representatives who identify as Black, Latinx, or multiracial Americans, AAPI state legislatures have the worst gender disparity. About 2 out of 3 AAPI new American state legislatures are men. And so I would love to ask you and kind of get your opinion as to what explains this gender disparity and this gender gap within AAPI political leadership, and how do you see this being remedied?
Sure. So just to put that in context, there are 7,383 state legislators in the country, and only 258 of them are first or second generation. So obviously more are third, fourth generation, but only 258 of the 7,383 are first or second gen. There are only 300 of those 7,300, so only 4% are Latino. And only 2% are APIs. And so I just want to be clear that the representation gap exists across the board. What Nick is pointing to is something that frankly we were surprised to see, is that that Asian American, that there's a bigger gap bigger gender gap, in the API community than in the other subgroups of immigrants that we looked at. And there's been a follow-up report that was published by Groundswell Action Fund and the API Civic Engagement Fund and our C4 to do interviews with Asian American women candidates to try to get at the bottom of that. But broadly, I would say that the gender gap that we see in representation is that is really an affirmation problem, right? That what's happening is women are not suffering from a lack of ambition or aspiration to serve their communities, but they are not being affirmed when they go to party leaders or donors, and sometimes even to community members when they ask, when they're going around kind of discussing whether they should be running for office, they are being strongly discouraged, and they're being discouraged with messages that that fall into kind of three general buckets. And one of them is, it's not your turn. This is a message that a lot of folks get, and particularly newcomers. So those can be newcomers to the country, to the city, to the town, but also newcomers to the political process, right? Like if you haven't been involved with the party. The second set of messages relate to some of what we've been talking about, which is your community doesn't vote, which implies that white voters or non-Asian American voters are not going to support you, which is, we know, not to be the case. And then the third is that people aren't ready to vote for someone like you, which is really another variation of like, you're not the kind of leader that we are looking for. I just want to be clear that 65% of our country's offices are being held by white men right now. This is not something that, we all wring our hands at the statistics, but it's completely intentional, right? Just like voter suppression is completely intentional. That's not happening because our communities don't know where to go or what to do. It's happening because the system was designed in a way that that was not meant to work for us. So the fact that we have so many white men in office is a direct function of the fact that white men created democracy in their image. And so the moment that we're in the 2020 elections and beyond is to really create a structure that is more conducive to success by women, conducive to non-patriarchal leadership, conducive to supportive and transformational governance rather than adversarial and transactional politics.
Thank you so much, Sayu, for delving into your research finding, into the details right there. I found that very informative. Being cognizant of the time and trying to make sure that there's enough time for Q&A. I can see some Q&A questions are coming in right now. I'd like to remind the audience to keep posting those questions and your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And not to switch gears completely, but I'd love to discuss something a little bit different, but it's a top priority for many young AAPI voters. There was a recent survey by Circle, which is the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University, led by Dr. Kei Kawashima Ginsburg. And her research team has found that the top two issues for young AAPI voters are climate change and racial injustice. So I'd love to discuss a little bit on the latter. I think I was intending to pose this just to kind of Alexis, but I'll open it up, actually cognizant of the time, to other panelists. But starting with Alexis, you recently wrote a letter as CEO of State Voices in which you kind of directly call out anti-Blackness as undermining our democracy and promote your, as well as your organization's vision of a multiracial democracy in the United States. And this not only resonates with me, but I think many people within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. There was a recent PBS docuseries called Asian Americans that was funded by the Wallace Coulter Foundation, which you mentioned, Alexis, which re-examined AAPI history and revisits how Asian Americans have historically been part of multiracial civil rights movements, from Larry Leong leading Filipino Americans on the West Coast with Cesar Chavez and UFW, to Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs working in collaboration with Malcolm X. Yet for every Kochiyama, there's a Tu Tao who is directly complicit in the murder of Black Americans. Anti-Blackness runs deep within the AAPI community. So I guess I'll first direct this towards Alexis, but in 2020, how can AAPI communities be better allies with their Black neighbors? And how can AAPIs most effectively work towards an equitable and, as your organization promotes, multiracial democracy?
Yeah, thanks so much for this important. I mean, we could probably have like a whole like series of conversations just on this topic. And so I'll say a few words. And I know my colleagues and panelists will have a lot more to say. But I think as you like lifted up what our vision is at State Voices is to build a multiracial democracy that's grounded in building power from Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, all folks of color, so we can thrive and live in our full dignity. That second part of that statement is essential because until we defeat anti-Blackness, until we center the humanity, right, of Black people, none of us will be free. None of us will be able to thrive as people of color in this country or be able to live in our full dignity. And, you know, I want to acknowledge that the umbrella categories of Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Islander Americans is interesting because, you know, more than 60% of the world population is Asian and Pacific Islander. And that's a lot of languages, cultures, values, you know, history, politics, and social norms squeezed into this single demographic category here in the United States. And this means, I think, as you lifted up, Nick, is like, as we talk about all quote unquote Asian Americans, anti-Blackness and, you know, multicultural democracy, we have to recognize the diversity within the term AAPI that complicates and really adds many layers to this conversation, even within and between Asian ethnicities and communities. There is historic and current racism, as there is in the Latinx community and other communities of color. And as we, as a Black woman, I see playing out through internalized oppression in the Black community. And, you know, anti-Blackness is about imposition and a hierarchy among humans. It's about, it's a cornerstone of inequity and injustice in our laws and our economy and our education, our democracy. And so much of this history has been intentionally obscured or rewritten. And as a result, so many folks of color don't have the full picture of like how and why our society is still, you know, suffering from this collective amnesia, not equipped to properly confront it. You know, in the context of the United States, to be anti-Black means that you support white supremacy. It means you support neocolonialism, because these two principles are built within our founding principles and are the powerful operating norms, right, and social rules. So I think that, you know, it's fundamental that, you know, that our anti-Blackness is working in ways and internalizing these norms and values so that they're impacting how we think, how we feel, our neighbors, our communities. So people may think that we're not, like, anti-Blackness is not your problem or not our problem, right? But it's been too long in our country's history and our social systems for anyone to be immune. And so I think it starts with folks like recognizing how it's showing up for yourself, how it's showing up in, you know, your social circles, your family, how it's showing up in the institutions that you're a part of. And as you lifted up, there's so much precedent for hope, but, you know, if you really want to start this work, I would say find an organizing community that speaks to you and your values, whether that's, you know, ethnic specific or a multiracial group or issue specific group or one that affirms your gender identity or sexuality, and find that organizing home and political home for yourself. You know, be cognizant of anti-Blackness and how this shows up and actually intersects with class, gender, and sexuality. Assert the need to identify and interrogate anti-Blackness, find ways for yourself in your organizing home to partner and follow Black leadership So many brave and amazing Black folks and young Black people are leading this work right now, and we have to trust them and follow them. You know, trust Black women is this saying because it's important. We're asking you to trust Black women, and just remember that this work is long. Like, our ancestors before us were doing this work for generations, and so, you know, I was told it takes as much time to put effort into the small things as the big things. So let's focus on the big things. Let's focus on what's transformative. And ideas can take a decade to see fruition. And I think we saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement coming up as an idea after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, coming to life in a new way now. Let's focus on the next decade and the decade ahead, so that we can see this progress in our lifetime, but we're also leaving something for the generations, you know, who are to come.
Thank you very much, Alexis. And I'd like to open it up to, actually, Terry, there's a question specifically for you in the Q&A. So I'd love to ask actually Sayu the same question, talking about inclusivity. You know that this is at the forefront of your organization. Could you speak a little bit more to this and how Asian Americans can be better allies with their Black neighbors, as well as, you touched upon this before, so I'm going to ask you, what effect do you think that Kamala Harris, being the first African American woman and Asian American to be on a major party ticket, will have on down ballot races and for communities of color across the country?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that there is I just want to acknowledge that people are pretty motivated to participate, and that what we saw in the primaries in New York City, in Georgia and other places was definitely a hunger to participate. So in the middle of like what is a pretty dire year overall, I just want to acknowledge that our communities are pretty mobilized and motivated, and that's to the credit of, you know, folks like Alexis and Terry. I do think that having Senator Harris on the ticket, you know, it's what I was saying earlier. There's two things that happen when someone like her is representing a community. One is that we see the possibility for our sisters and our daughters and ourselves to be in that role. You know, we must acknowledge that she has done harm, and that she is not going to be universally accepted, and is not universally accepted. But I was on a panel last night where we talked a lot about, you know, the role of relationship in reconciliation. And that she has some growth to do around these issues. But there's no question that this is a historic ticket, and that many of us who identify with her as a woman of color, as a South Asian, as a daughter of South Asian immigrants, as a Black woman, are, you know, we needed something to be excited about this year, and we definitely have that in her. I think the work doesn't stop after Election Day. If they're elected, we have a lot of work to do to ensure that the Biden-Harris team are accountable to our communities. So I will say that. And then your other question, you know, I think, look, we also run a multiracial organization, and I think there is a lot of danger, and I'll acknowledge that I think sometimes we have engaged in this, that they're in seeking commonality, right? In the commonality of our immigrant experience, we might sometimes engage in erasure. And that's just something that we are learning to be more cognizant about, that the experience of a Black immigrant to the United States is very different than my experience as an immigrant. And while we might share challenges as immigrants, we have very different experiences of what it means to integrate and access opportunities in this country. And so I think that the work that we have to do is help people see how, what are our common challenges, but doing that in a way that doesn't erase that. And I think there's, you know, someone asked a question about this, I think a question related to this in the chat, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just briefly say that there is a very dangerous myth of meritocracy in this country, and immigrants are very much susceptible to believing in that myth, right? Because it allows us to believe that our individual success is a product of our own or that our success is a product of our individual work, but actually we know that communities are pitted against each other. We also know that individual success is relatively meaningless if our communities are being left behind. And as long as not everyone has access to the same opportunities, in cases equitable opportunity distribution, then we really haven't achieved anything resembling a meritocracy. But it is a myth that many of our family members and community members believe in, and I think we have to help them acknowledge and break that down.
Thank you very much, Sayu. And now I'd love to go to the Q&A section. There's a question, I got multiple questions here, and I'd love to direct the first one to Terry. There's a question from Professor Wong, who was recently interviewed on The Dive with Latasha Brown, and talking about similar things that she talked about in the interview here. Just wondering, is there a targeted effort to help people cure ballots that have been rejected in places where that is possible?
So I would say there isn't a specific campaign to do that, but certainly anybody who needs assistance and calls us on our hotline at 888-API-VOTE, we're more than happy to help with that. I also mentioned we have partners who are working directly with voters on the ground through some Get Out the Vote campaigns, including in places like Florida, Ohio, Minnesota, and other places. So I think those are all issues that we are definitely on the lookout for. We recognize that there are many different moving parts going on right now in all the different states. So definitely one thing that we are hoping to be able to help voters with.
Thank you very much, Terry. There's another question. Actually, I think I'm going to direct this one to Alexis because you mentioned misinformation campaigns. There's a question from Henrietta. She's talking about her father as a naturalized Korean American citizen with lack of English fluency. And he apparently tends to self-select this information and news that he wants to hear, which thus influences his voting behavior. So Alexis, I'm wondering if you can talk about how do you engage AAPI voters, or more broadly citizens with language barrier, amidst the amount of misinformation that is out there?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. I'm sure Terry and Sayu will also have some additional resources. I mean, what we do is really at the local level. And so our organizations are working with, AAPI and other communities of color on a regular basis. Sorry, I just saw the answer. That on a regular basis to build trust. And so then providing, more information and education on a regular basis. And so it's actually being built into service providing centers, into community centers, into, neighborhood community groups. And so that's a way that we're trying to combat disinformation, misinformation, and also allow folks to have real, conversations and be able to also be culturally relevant. And so that there's not folks who don't understand that culture, aren't speaking those languages, who are doing that work in the community. And so that they're part of this broader strategy, but the investment is going directly into that community and directly into folks who are from that community, right? And so it allows for more honest conversation and for some of those tensions to be able to come up. Depending upon if you have, specific community or area that you're working in, I could see if there's already an organization that is, in whatever city and state that you're in that's doing that work and connect you. Feel free to visit our website to get more information, and I know they'll put it in the chat. I don't know if Terry or Sayu have other follow-up.
So this is Terry. I would just agree that, making sure that language is a part of campaigns to engage with LEP voters is important. As I mentioned, we have a number of in-language materials that are on our website. Korean, of course, is one of the languages in which we support. The fact sheets, I would also note that we will shortly have up a link for a Google link for people to report misinformation and disinformation. And we are collecting in language, items, if you will, as well, so that we can work to try to both correct it, whether that's going straight to a platform, if that's where the problem is, or helping to push out and get the correct information out to our community members in the appropriate linguistic and culturally appropriate manners. And of course, any questions, particularly Korean, is a language that is covered by our hotline. So feel free to have folks call us on that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Sayu, you want to pick up this one, or I'd actually love to, I guess this will be the last one, and then I would love to provide a little bit of time at the very end to provide you all with some time for closing remarks. But Sayu, I think that you actually answered this question that is posed in the Q&A, but I would love for you to potentially expand on it. Amy asked, what are some current races where AAPI votes could swing an election?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't prepared fully for this question because I thought this was a C3 conversation, but I did mention Gina Ortiz-Jones is running in San Antonio. And actually, you know what? I answered that question as AAPIs who could swing a district. So Gina Ortiz-Jones is running in a district that was represented by a Republican in San Antonio, Texas. So she would be the first Filipina American female to serve in Congress if she got elected. And then Michelle Au is a doctor, Chinese American doctor running in Georgia. She's already won her primary. And she, she's in a competitive but leading Democratic district in Georgia. And so I think that's an interesting race to be watching. And of course, our most important Asian American candidate for to flip the country is Kamala Harris. So in every district in America, I think every single vote counts. I've been saying this over and over and over that we need to, you need to do everything you possibly can to get anybody you possibly know to cast a vote, because I do think that the way we're going to win this is like historic levels of turnout, because that'll counter at least some of, I'm sure Alexis and Terry can speak to this more concretely, but we need to counter the inevitable voter suppression that we're going to see, and the glitches, if you will, let's call them that, glitches with absentee ballots and the like. So unless we have unprecedented levels of turnout, we're going to have potentially something contested, and nobody wants that.
Very true. I'm very cognizant of the time though, and I would love to provide a couple minutes for closing remarks. So in the same order, Alexis, Terry, and Sayu, I'd love to offer a minute or so of closing remarks. Could I start with Alexis?
Sure. I just want to say thank you again for having us. I think this conversation around how we're building collective power and doing so as a foundation of really coming together and building, a multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy is core to every single one of us. And I think, Nick, you lifted up that racial justice, like hearing that racial justice is core to young Asian Americans is, so important. And this makes me more hopeful, and I think this is across the board with so many young folks. And so I think that if there are things that we can do in our efforts, it's to continue to invest in and listen and trust our young people, because they're guiding us in a new transformative and way right now, and being visionary and bold. And so, it's always those ideas that seem like so radical that you can't put your hands on that are going to impact people's lives the most. So, and I truly believe it's going to take like all of us in order to get there. And so I both am sitting with a lot of anxiety about the next 28 days, and also the hope of what's possible beyond this moment in time.
Hi. So I will take my few moments and try to sneak in one more answer to the last question I saw in the Q&A around national polls. And certainly, I think that is absolutely correct that we, it's an area where we're seeing some gains in that previously in previous national polls around voter engagement or voters, likely voters, election results and whatnot, never reported out on Asian Americans. We start to see it now a little bit more than we've seen it in the past, but that's certainly not, we're not where we need to be. And another thing I would mention, the other tricky part about doing national polls for the community, as I mentioned, our population is highly, it's highly immigrant and it has a lot of language needs. So polls that are done only in English will provide you a skewed view. It's a view that we didn't have before, but it can also be, that's the double-edged sword that it may appear a particular way for the community when it's really only for, fluent and or primarily native born respondents. So I just wanted to flag, I think that is absolutely some place where we will need to continue to do great work. But, Advancing Justice-AAJC was happy to partner with AAPI data and with API Vote in producing the survey that we were able to produce and release about a week or so ago. And we will continue to work to try to make sure that our community is represented because we are highly diverse. We are, highly, across the board when it comes to different data points and whatnot. So it is critical for our community's entire voice and presence to be seen.
Great, and I'll concentrate specifically on running for office. So one piece of data that I want to share is that between 2015 and 2020, the number or the percentage of white state legislators has gone down by 5%, and the percentage of women legislators has gone up by 5%. So, we're making incremental progress towards parity. Two, I want to really encourage those of you on this call who are even thinking about it to think about running for office, because I do think that there's lots of work that we do on the social justice in the social justice sector that is very important, direct service, advocacy. But when you're in office, the potential to change one policy can change thousands of people's lives. And I just think that's really important. And then lastly, I would say that as you think about running for office, do not be limited by what the makeup of the district is. If you grew up there, belong to that community, are moved by that community, then you're just as well positioned to run for office as anyone else. And if you need any proof of what kind of qualifications you need to be in office, you have only to look at our current president and know that actually you don't need to have any special qualifications to win a seat. So I'm sure that many of you are much better committed and much more qualified than he is. And I think that we're gonna get to much more rapid change if we, as in the words of Ayanna Pressley, those of us who are closest to the pain become closer to the power.
A beautiful way to end this discussion. I just want to thank you all so much for a lovely and very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for the panelists for joining us. Thank you to the audience for tuning in to discuss AAPI civic engagement in the 2020 elections. It's really appreciated, and thank you so much, and have a nice rest of your day or night from wherever you're tuning in from.